Thank you, everyone, for joining me during the live studies. This is another look at eschatology, a biblical study of end-time events, and this is the first hour-long part of our study, broken up into 3 separate videos on YouTube. Looking at my screen right now, what you should be able to see is the topical index that we've been working from. As you can see, 1, 2, 3, and 4 are already struck through, so we're working through topic 5, Book of Daniel, the 70 weeks of Daniel. Just briefly, let me flash some screen images in front of you. We looked at prophetic telescoping, where prophecies will deal with indication. They will indicate instances of historical events that take place near to the prophet's writing. Like you see a little guy standing over there on the right side of the screen, left side of the screen. That's the prophet holding his little sheep staff there, shepherd staff. And there's a near fulfillment of that prophecy, oftentimes maybe right around the corner or within a generation of his telling it. And then in the time gap, there is another far fulfillment. You see that taller mountain peak. That will be the far fulfillment. But from his perspective, oftentimes he may not see that time gap between the two. And this is important for 2 main reasons that I'm emphasizing this. One of the reasons is because it's entirely likely at times that God, it's almost like he recycles prophecy. He'll speak the prophecy once to the prophet, and yet the details of the prophecy will be used twice. So we have one telling of the prophecy, and yet there'll be 2 fulfillments, a near fulfillment and a far fulfillment. Sometimes there'll even be more, but it's very rare if there's more than 2. As far as I can ascertain, there's usually only just 2. Sometimes only 1, sometimes 2, but not likely more than 2. The other reason why this is important for us in terms of eschatology or end-time prophecy is because of the types and shadows aspect going on. We'll read about a near prophecy, and it may not be intended to have another far fulfillment, but instead it'll have a type and shadow aspect where the aspects or qualities or details given in the prophecy are meant to remind us of something that's going to happen later on, not necessarily in perfect fulfillment of the first one, but giving us almost like a dress rehearsal, a practice run. Something else that I don't seem to be emphasizing enough, but I'm doing it right now for us, is the fact that oftentimes a prophecy will have a partial fulfillment in the near category, and then it'll have its complete fulfillment in the far category. So when you're reading the prophecies, particularly ones about whole nations or countries or kingdoms like ancient Babylon that we're going to be reading about quite a bit of in the book of Revelation and Daniel and things like that. All these kingdoms and such, for instance, let me just zero in and give you one that's appropriate for the topic at hand. In the book of Daniel, chapters 2 and chapter 7 and chapter 9, we're dealing with this 4th beast who is himself a mirror image of the 4th metal in Nebuchadnezzar's statue. So Daniel chapter 2, 4 metals. Daniel chapter 7, 4 beasts. The 4th metal in the statue image of Daniel chapter 2 corresponds directly to the 4th beast in Daniel chapter 7. And in near fulfillment, far fulfillment, or partial fulfillment and complete fulfillment, we have this metal having details about it and the beast having details that we read about that were partially fulfilled in the 1st century, right, because they both deal with the same entity, which is Rome, and yet they're not fully fulfilled. For instance, in the metals, there are 10 toes in the statue, and yet in Daniel chapter 7, the 4th beast has 10 horns, and yet Rome didn't have as much 10 associations with it at the time. What we're looking for then are details of the little horn who comes up, who rises up out of the other 10. The 11th horn who speaks boastful words, corresponding with the Antichrist figure who's going to come on the scene and do all the boastful things and atrocious things that we're going to be reading about here in Daniel chapter 9, perhaps tonight. And with that perspective, we then understand that even in the historical time period of ancient Rome of the 1st century, western half of ancient Rome, not the eastern half, western Rome, there weren't any really indications that this was completely fulfilled in the historical time of Rome, right? We didn't have some figure rise up and do all the things that Daniel prophesied he would do. There was kind of partial fulfillment, right, in some of the Roman emperors, right, Nero, Vespasian, and things like that. but nothing that really matched exactly what Daniel was talking about. So thus we realize that it was kind of a partial fulfillment, and yet there will be a final total fulfillment in the man known as Antichrist, the man of lawlessness who's going to come on the scene in the future. At least that's according to the futurist. So that's why prophetic telescoping becomes important. We also talked about how that preterist and futurist perspectives on the books of Daniel and Revelation will greatly impact your understanding of end-time prophecy. If you're a preterist, you believe that basically everything was smashed into first century 70 AD, 70 AD with the destruction of the temple, and the plowing under of Jerusalem later on and things like that. You're going to be what you believe are the complete fulfillments of biblical prophecy if you're a preterist. Whether you're a full-blown, and I've been doing a little bit more research on this, partial preterism and full-blown preterism, they both have too many things in common that make me comfortable to want to even embrace those particular hermeneutic perspectives. There's just too much that they're trying to say has already completely been done away with, already fulfilled, that I can really trust that system of theology. Instead, the futurist is the perspective that seems to allow for the most natural reading of the text and allow for things to happen naturally and realistically and factually, without trying to spiritualize and allegorize and things like that. The historicist that you see on the top of the screen there, that kind of runs from full left to full right, that one has a little bit more applicability to what we might see, but it also allows for a spiritualization because it doesn't lock things in time. It simply just kind of scatters them across the time, almost in what we might call idealist fashion, or kind of storytelling fashion. Stories for the ages, things like that. Those were the timelines we looked at. There's your Daniel 2 and 7 compared, in case you're interested. Again, the image in Daniel chapter 2 that we're dealing with, and also the 70 weeks of Daniel that we're going to be talking about tonight, just flashing through these images real quick that you remember from last week. Go back and listen to episode number 212 on my YouTube channel. 70 weeks of Daniel is broken up, as we already talked about, into 3 separate segments: 7 weeks, 62 weeks, and 1 week. And this is given to us right in the language that Daniel supplies for us in the vision itself. So there's no need for me to assume and to imagine that this is what it should look like. This is how Daniel gives it to us. 7 weeks, which of course, as you know, is 49 years, 7 weeks of 7, where the word week there represents a year, a biblical year, a prophetic year, Hebraic year, whatever you want to call it, a 360-day, 12 months of 30 days each year from the biblical perspective. 7 weeks was the first breakdown. 62 weeks is the second breakdown. And then 1 week is the final breakdown. We'll look at other charts that kind of fill in the years aspect. Here's Daniel. 70 weeks is seen through this particular lens with most of the details I agree with. And then we had this perspective, which is Daniel's 70 weeks of 49 years according to the preterist perspective. Notice they take the last 7 years, the far right of your screen, and place that in the first century, effectively ruling out any possibility of a physical resurrection, a physical second coming of Messiah, a physical persecution from the Antichrist, tribulation time period, mark of the beast, all of the things that we're used to reading about in the book of Revelation. The partial preterist takes the last 3 chapters of the book of Revelation that deal with, like, say, I believe the bodily second coming of Christ, not the rapture, but the bodily second coming of Christ, the establishment of the new kingdom on earth, and they take that and they make that still literal. So there's at least some agreement with futurists there. But other than that, I'm finding that even partial preterism runs dangerously close to robbing the Bible of what should be things that we should really be looking forward to. Some of them good, some of them bad. For instance, again, the preterism position itself as a whole has just some really questionable perspectives that I can't really get on board with. Other than the fact that if I, as a futurist, will recognize that certain parts of prophecy have already been fulfilled either in near term and will be again fulfilled far term, and or they've been partially fulfilled and will be again fulfilled later, or they've been fulfilled in type or in shadow fashion and will be repeated again in type fashion, like type and shadow, then I can say, yeah, some of preterism is helpful. But otherwise, as on the whole, there's more bad than good, more dangerous than helpful in my estimation. Brother Alan Parr, a great YouTuber, I can't recommend his channel enough. Alan Parr, Parr. His YouTube channel is called The Beat, B-E-A-T. He's got another chart here that I found extremely helpful that breaks down Daniel's 70th week along the 49 years of rebuilding Jerusalem, 7 weeks of years. And then right after that, we have the 434 years, the 62 weeks that follow, which is the period leading up to the coming of the Prince, Messiah the Prince. And then we have that little gap in the middle there with the prophetic time of the Gentiles, aka the church age, which in hindsight we know must exist even if Daniel didn't see it at the time. And yet we do realize that it's a part of historical occurrences that God foresaw, but just didn't tell the prophets about earlier. And then you can see on the far right of your screen, the last 7 years, or the 70th week, which we're going to look at eventually, is broken up into 2 periods of 3.5 and 3.5 years that most Bible students would refer to as the 7-year tribulation. I don't think the tribulation itself is 7 years long, but we'll talk about that later on. And then I added... this chart here is basically a repeat of the familiar charts. Only difference is the starting point, decree of Artaxerxes. And then I added a final chart this week from a Christian YouTuber by the name of Mike Winger, W-I-N-G-E-R, Winger. And again, very highly recommended YouTube teacher. And here's kind of a general timeline of what we've been looking at, and this will kind of place us right into where we're talking about what we're talking about tonight. General timeline of this prophecy in Daniel is that there's a command that goes out. This is kind of the simplified version. I'm trying to keep this simple for you, make it not very complicated. But there's the general timeline of the prophecy. Then there's the command that goes out. There's 480 years that goes by, which is 69 weeks. And then Jerusalem is rebuilt. Right, 7 weeks, he says there in a question mark. And then the Messiah comes on the scene. Next, the Messiah dies for others, implied fulfillment of suffering passages related to Messiah, like Isaiah chapter 53, meaning the language that Daniel uses that he'll be cut off, but not for himself. And then we say that Jerusalem is destroyed. After that, the new temple that was already rebuilt is destroyed again. New temple, Jerusalem destroyed, new temple is destroyed. And then we jump all the way in time past the gap to the 7th week, which begins with a 7-year covenant. Again, from Daniel's perspective, it almost looked like probably the whole 490 years was just going to go ahead without any gap. Daniel wasn't shown the gap. That was because the church age, aka the times of Gentiles, is a mystery that God hid from the prophets. Therefore, it makes sense why Daniel wouldn't see it. And yet, that's what also creates this kind of fuzzy feeling near/far aspect of the tail end of the prophecy, especially when we start getting down into the 4th metal, the 4th beast, and the verse 27 of Daniel 9. That's where it starts. That's why it's hard for preterists and futurists to kind of come to the same agreement, is because the preterists are working from the idea that Daniel was seeing the whole prophecy almost as if it was going along sequentially without any breaks. And so the preterist prefers that perspective because they're seeing that at the 1st century when Messiah came, there was this now aspect of the tail end of the prophecy. And yet the futurist recognizes that there's a gap and now there's a not yet aspect. Remember, there's a graphic that I'll put on the screen in post-production that shows that we're living in this overlap between the now and the not yet. The future has invaded the present. The messianic age that is still future has been inaugurated in the 1st century, and therefore we've been living in this now and not yet near far aspect of where there's an overlap, as it were, of the future has already been started, and yet it's not yet here yet. That's why from Daniel's perspective, it looks like it's just one long-running prophecy, and yet from our perspective, we realize there's a 2,000-year gap. Both of them are accurate to some degree, and yet we have to the way to reconcile those two seemingly opposing perspectives of preterism and futurism when it comes to these prophecies is to realize that there's this near-far aspect, partial fulfillment, total fulfillment, etc., etc. So Mike Winger is simply showing us what it would look like if there was no gap. But 70 week begins with a 7-year covenant. Sacrifice stopped implies a third temple, abomination of desolation at the far end. Again, we know now from hindsight, which is always 2020, that we must have the gap because the temple has been destroyed for nearly 2,000 years. Israel got kicked out of her land for a while, so none of those details about temple sacrifices being disrupted by an Antichrist type figure and all of these things, none of that really could have made sense until Israel came back into her land, and we're still waiting for some type of temple to be rebuilt. So let's read the relevant passages and then jump right into the study. This is Daniel 9, 24, 25, 26, and 27, as read from the NASB version of your Bible. 70 weeks have been decreed for your people and your holy city to finish the transgression, to make an end of sin, to make atonement for iniquity, to bring in everlasting righteousness, to seal up vision and prophecy, and to anoint the most holy place. Verse 25, so you are to know and discern that from the issuing of a decree to restore and rebuild Jerusalem until Messiah the Prince, there will be 7 weeks and 62 weeks. It will be built again with plaza and moat, even in times of distress. Verse 26, Then after the 62 weeks, the Messiah will be cut off and have nothing, and the people of the prince who is to come will destroy the city and the sanctuary, and its end will come with a flood. Even to the end there will be war, desolations are determined. And the final pasuk, the final verse 27, and he will make a firm covenant with the many for 1 week, but in the middle of the week he will put a stop to sacrifice and grain offering, and on the wing of abominations will come one who makes desolate, even until a complete destruction, one that is decreed, is poured out on the one who makes desolate. So, that's what we have to deal with. 4 scant verses. Remember, in the original version of the Hebrew that Daniel wrote down, and by this time in his book, he's already switched back over to Hebrew. He wrote in Aramaic for a good chunk of his letter, but now he's back in Hebrew. And in the original Hebrew, there weren't any verse breaks. So what we're going to be finding out as we look at different versions of which I'm going to read tonight, I'm not going to read the Hebrew, that's too lengthy, but I will show you the Septuagint Greek English translation, and then I'm going to show you the Latin Vulgate from a translation of that, and then I'm going to show you a traditional Jewish 1700-year-old Jewish Publication Society version. And what we're going to be finding out is that depending on what the translator's bias is towards the text, there will be different paragraph breaks or what we might call section breaks where a period stops, a new sentence begins, or a semicolon, things like that. And it makes the prophecy either sound more like a preterist sounding prophecy or more of a futurist or some type of eclectic version with a mix. So let me read those for you real quick. Here's Daniel 9, 24 through 27 in the Septuagint. You can see the English and then Hebrew, and then you can see the Greek here, which I'm not going to read also. Instead, I just want to read the English translation from the Greek so you can see what might be some slight differences. There are 2 translations here that I'm working from. The Alexandrinus translation over on the left, or in this case, it's the Old Greek, and then on the right side is normally the Vaticanus, but this time, yes, it's still Vaticanus, but it's Brenton's, the Sir Lancelot Brenton. He's a famous Septuagint translator. He translated this into English, and he's one of the more reliable, trustworthy Septuagint translators that are out there. Brenton, Brenton, Brenton. So here's Brenton's English translation on the right, which I'm going to be using. 70 weeks have been determined on your people and on the holy city. Pay attention to the commas, by the way. And on the holy city and the periods. For sin to be ended and to seal up let me try this, sorry. I want to make it large there. There we go. 70 weeks have been determined on your people and on the holy city for sin to be ended and to seal up transgressions and to blot out the iniquities and to make atonement for iniquities and to bring in everlasting righteousness and to seal the vision and the prophet and to anoint the most holy. Sorry. There we go. Verse 25, and you shall know and understand that from the going forth of the command for the answer and for the building of Jerusalem until Christ the Prince, there shall be 7 weeks and 62 weeks, and then the time shall return, and the street shall be built, and the wall and the times shall be exhausted. FYI, for those of you who are wondering, why did Brenton put Christ in there? Yes, he's a Christian translator, and is that his bias? Actually, no, the Greek word says Christos, right, which is the Greek word for Christ, which is from the Hebrew word Mashiach, which is where we get our English word Messiah, but it simply means the anointed one. But it actually says Christos, and we'll look at the differences later on.